the reason they did that was because Alexandria was across the Nile River. Arabs didn't like crossing rivers. They had camels. They didn't want to cross the rivers. They weren't water people. They were desert people. They moved the capital over to Cairo, which is still there today. But there were Christian activities going on in these early years, or years while the Muslims were building their forces in this area, in this region. Let me see if I can get this going here. Let's flip this just run it back up here. Remember, this is the region when Muhammad died. This is about what was belonging to the Muslims. This was the area which Muhammad had taken, his forces had taken. And I think really Muhammad really had the idea he just wanted Arabia to be monotheistic, wanted to be this area where he would be in control. I'm not sure he really had a worldwide conquest idea, although he may have. Certainly his followers thought so, and they pursued it even further. And then the years after he died, of course, the Muslims moved into, as you see, the north, where Baghdad is there, that green area from the north and northeast, moving all the way eventually over to India, moving and conquering those places. But what was going on in the Christian world during that time? John of Damascus was a Christian. Let me back it up here. That's just an idea. This is an artist's sketch of what he might look like. He lived in the house of a caliph, Caliph al-Walid. He was a member of his household. His father was actually the household, the chief administrator for this caliph. Now remember what a caliph is, a successor of Muhammad. So he was born around 675, died around 749. So this is after, of course, Muhammad lived. I don't know how many years after Muhammad had died, he came along. So, but he grew up in this household, father being an administrator. You remember that the Muslims, when they conquer people, they would kill the men, take the women and children to slavery. Well, there were a lot of slaves going around that region. His father, I don't know his name, but his father purchased, as he was a Christian, but he worked for this Muslim leader. And so when he would see these slaves, these Christian slaves, he would try to purchase many of them, set them free, or give them a place to live in safety. And he had some of those Christian slaves were well-educated people, as you can imagine. So he had the slaves teach his son, that's John here, teaching him all kinds of just mathematics, writing, reading, all these things. So John was a very educated man. He wanted to follow his father. He became a Christian. And for some reason, as he got older, living in his household, had a lot of influence. He was at odds with the church leaders in Constantinople. I don't know why. People, kind of conjectured what the problem was. That maybe it was because of his opposition about the Pope's ban on relics and imagery. A lot of those things in those days, if you had a piece of the cross, or you owned something that claimed to come from the Holy Land, that would make you something super spiritual. Anyway, the Pope somehow had an opposition to that. Anyway, the Pope or someone had forged a fake letter in his name. And he, of course, living in the caliph's house, the letter had to do with he was going to either move or do something opposing this caliph, signed or forged by his name, came to the caliph's attention, and when he found it, he ordered his hand, John's hand, to cut off. Now, it was all set up, probably, from the record show. But because of that, John left that household, went to a monastery, and began writing about the Islam religion, at least telling some of the things about it that he knew. So you can see the dates here on this. The time he lived, 40 years or so, 50 years after Muhammad's death, describing Islam. He described it as a heresy of Christianity. Now, probably a little bit wide of that, because basically what he thought was much of Israel, and because he grew up there, he knew everything or a lot about the Islamic religion. He called it a deceptive superstition of the Ishmaelites. Ishmael, of course, being Abraham's son through Hagar, this line. He was commending them on one hand because he said, well, at least these people are bringing the the branch of Abraham, which would be Ishmaelites, at least bringing them into monotheism. That was his positive thing to say about the Islam religion. But he did say Jews, Arians, and Nestorians. Arians are what we consider today Jehovah's Witnesses. Nestorians were those who felt like there were two natures of Christ and kept them separate. They were heresies that divided the church in those days. We talked about that before. It created real conflict because people didn't understand it. It was a heresy that nobody understood, especially unbelievers like Muhammad. From each of these, he said, Muhammad acquired a particular teaching and then formed his own heresy. He said, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, is a false prophet who came across the Old Testament and New Testament and devised his own heresy. You read the Old Testament, and I've been reading the book of Deuteronomy lately, reading about the Jews coming in and conquering and taking people, and God saying, wipe them all out. Well, I have a feeling Muhammad saw that and thought, oh, that's a good idea. Let's get this into our religion. And some of the things that Jesus perhaps said, and thought, this is great. And you remember I talked about some of the heretical writings, the early false gospels were written about Jesus as a carpenter cutting a board short and pulling it out and all that. You know, those things that are legends that had nothing to do with Scripture. And but Muhammad believed him and put a lot of that into his Quran. So he created his own heresy according to John of Damascus. He also believed that the ideas that Muhammad came up with about marriage, remember, multiple wives, slaves, concubines, raping on the battlefield, all those things, he felt like those were developed as self-serving devices. In other words, he could do as he wanted to because God told him he could do it. That's what John of Damascus felt like. So here's a man just a few years, not even a century after Muhammad, who's describing in great detail this religion of Islam. So you can imagine today, if you go back to some of those early writings of Muhammad and compare to what John of Damascus, it's a heresy. He's just pulling together some things he learned and to protect and support his own false lifestyle, he's made up his own religion. Pope Gregory is the next one we come across. Born in 540, became Pope in 590. Now, you think, well, popes, he was a good one. In fact, John Calvin, centuries later, said Gregory, and we know him today as Gregory the Great, was the last good pope. So he was a Protestant person speaking positively of a Catholic pope. But anyway, he was a bishop of Rome from 590 to 604. And he didn't live, he was raised in a monastery. Now you think of monasteries and monks and places where, we think of that as, oh man, those people were weird, they went off by themselves. But you got to keep in mind, these centuries of these monasteries, they preserved some things, namely the Word of God. They kept the writings and they studied them, and even though it was an isolated environment, they kept what we have today. We're privileged to have that. So there's a lot we owe to the ancient monks and monasteries who had those people. He grew up in that. He didn't really want to be the bishop of Rome, but he was sort of involuntarily put in the position, and he took it over, and he experienced a lot of freedom because Rome, let me put that little map back up here. Well, you can't see it very well here, but anyway. Nope, go back here. Rome, located, of course, right here in the Italian Peninsula. Constantinople, right over here. Well, in those days, Constantinople was basically headquarters of what was left of Rome, which was Byzantine Empire, which is around here. The rest of Rome was conquered by the Visigoths and others, and except for a little area here, Rome was surrounded by pagan people, or at least not Orthodox people, I should say, and mostly barbarians and so forth. But anyway, here's the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope here, Gregory. He has a lot of freedom because he doesn't have to, he's so far away from Constantinople, where the emperor was. Emperor more or less ran the show over the religious leaders. But he had a lot of freedom where he was. He was down the slave market, or in Rome, walking around one day, and he saw some very fair-skinned, blonde people who were being sold as slaves. He said to them, who are those people? They said they came from England, or Britannica in those days. And he was just so impressed. He thought, I want to send some missionaries to that place. In fact, he said the statement, if I can find it here, they're not Angles, which we call English, but angels. That's supposedly a quote that he made. I don't know if he really said it or not. But he decided to send a missionary, at least one, to England, and he did. He sent Augustine, sent to Kent. The king there was Ethelbert. His wife was Bertha. Bertha was a Christian from France. Her parents, of course, all those intermarriages in those days had to do with political things, but she was a Christian, so it made sense to send him to the area of Kent, which he was the king over. He became a Christian, professed Christianity. Augustine became the bishop, or I call it Bishop of Canterbury, one of the first ones of those days. Augustine died about the same time the Pope did, but Augustine then sent missionaries over to the Netherlands and then to Germany. So you can imagine here's a man who we think of as just Gregory the Great, some guy of history centuries ago. But he had this foresight to send some missionaries, which affected us, because our ancestors came from England, Germany, and those types of places where the gospel went forth. And Augustine, let's see what else I want to say about him. Oh, let me read one more person's view. This is much later. This is the 12th, 13th century. A man by the name of Thomas Aquinas. You've heard of him, perhaps. He's a very prolific writer of the church in those days. This is, again, long before the Reformation. But St. Thomas Aquinas wrote in a book called Sin of the Gentiles, Muhammad, speaking about Islam, he said, Muhammad seduced the people by promises of carnal pleasure, to which the lust of the flesh goaded us. And he gave free rein to carnal pleasure. And this is someone, what would this be, 600 years after Muhammad. So again, Christianity and others all through the centuries have looked at this belief, or this system of belief, so-called Islam, and said these things. He gave free rein to carnal pleasure. And all this, as is not unexpected, he was obeyed by carnal men. What does that mean? People with the flesh. Hey, I like the idea. Let's go fight and win these lands over here, and all the spoil and all the wealth can become ours. So they were after carnal things. They weren't really a religious group. As for proofs of the truth of his doctrine, he brought forward only such as could be grasped by the natural ability of anyone with a very modest wisdom. The people who followed him weren't too bright. This is 1258, he's writing this thing. Indeed, the truths that he taught, he mingled with many false fables and doctrines of the greatest falsity. He did not bring forth any signs produced in a supernatural way. In other words, he was not a miracle worker, which alone fittingly gives witness to divine inspiration. Muhammad said that he was sent in the power of his arms, which are signs not lacking even to robbers and tyrants. In other words, you'll even get a crowd of thieves to follow you if that's all you got. Those who believed in him were brutal men and desert wanderers, utterly ignorant of all divine teaching, through whose numbers Muhammad forced others to become his followers by violence of his arms. He perverts almost all the testimonies of the Old and New Testaments by making them into fabrications of his own, as can be seen by anyone who examines his law, the Quran, of course. It was therefore a shrewd decision on his part to forbid his followers to read the Old and New Testaments, lest these books convict him of falsity. Isn't that interesting? 1258. And Muslims even today outlaw Bibles in their lands. He says, it is thus clear that those who place any faith in his words believe foolishly. You see these things through ancient history, and even today, we're, 800 years from when Aquinas said those words. Nobody, because of political correctness, would say something like that. But it's true. It was only by force and by ignorance, and people who did not know the Bible, and today don't know the Bible, because it's not allowed in our country, that has that effect over the years. Moving on now, westward across and North Africa. Here's the picture here. Of course, the map you see here. And what, of course, they owned at that time. Muhammad had all this territory here pretty much. They were continuing to move west or eastward across this way. But I think his name is, that should be a Q instead of a G. I realize I wrote that wrong on there. His name was Uqba. He was the general who led an army from Alexandria here all the way across North Africa. See this green strip right there. Went to Carthage up here and all the way over to the Strait of Gibraltar there. It says when he got to the Atlantic Ocean that Uqba said, Allahu Akbar. which means God is great. The same thing that folks said when they blew up the trade centers and other places. You know, in other words, God is great. And he looked out across the Atlantic and said, if I could just go further, I'd conquer more. Well, he was pretty proud of what he had done. There was very little resistance across this North Africa, all through this area. He would go from place to place, found little resistance because, first of all, the theological division we talked about, the Nestorians and the Monophysites, these people who believed that Jesus was God, but he was just clothed in flesh. There was not really, there was just one nature. And that's the Monophysites, which means one nature. Nestorians believed the two natures, but they didn't combine. The Orthodox view, the Council of Chalcedon, was that there are two natures in Christ, fully divine, without any division. They're completely one together. When Jesus says, I am, he's speaking about himself one, not I am the God side versus the man side. And that was the Orthodox position. It's what we believe today. But those things divided that early church. And all through North Africa, that division was very, very clear in a group called the Donatists. I don't know fully what they haven't had a chance to really study their beliefs, but basically these same heretical views were involved in all of these churches across North Africa. And Byzantine, that red area to the north there, it controlled all the Mediterranean Sea. Their navies were controlling all this region. And all these cities, Alexandria, Carthage, and all these others, were influenced by the Byzantine Empire. Byzantines were this Monophysite belief, and they forced their belief on people. So when the people in those northern African countries had the option of having the Muslims come, they thought, well, welcome, come on in, because we're tired of this group from the Byzantine Empire controlling it. They believe that these folks along here too, in the mountains of the interior, probably up along this line here, all those mountains, there were a group of people called the Berbers. They were also called Moors. And these folks were very proud people. They too were tired of this treatment by the Byzantine Empire. They were welcoming these invaders coming in. The Moors, the Berbers, though, were very stubborn people. While they hated Byzantines, they would join in the cause of the Muslims, but they'd go back and forth. You know, there was no real conviction of any of their hearts. And as you notice across the northern end of Africa there, all through there, partially desert regions, these countries today are still desert, you know, Morocco, all those countries. And they traveled on camels. The Islamic people, the Muslim people, that was their mode of transportation. And because of the fact that they were on camel, they were land people, and the Byzantines were on ships and navies, and they had control of this region because of their navy. Their navy could supply Carthage and Alexandria and places. Even though the Muslims had conquered them, they were not there to occupy them, and they'd go back and forth. It wasn't until 698 that the Islamic people realized we need a navy. And they got a navy because they kept getting beaten by the Byzantine navy. They finally took over some of their ships. They formed their own, and they became the owners, you might say, of the Mediterranean. Because of that, they control that North Africa region there, of course. And of course, at the far western side, the very tip, is what's called the Strait of Gibraltar, called in those days Pillar of Hercules, and land of Hispania. That's in Spain, just to the north there. In 414, the Visigoths had conquered that region of Spain, and for 200 years, the Visigoths had controlled that region. Of course, the people of Hispania, or the Muslims called it, the Romans called it Hispania, the Muslims called it Andalusia. I don't know if that's important or not, but that was what it was. Visigoths were Arian. Think of Jehovah's Witnesses. Visigoths had this heresy of Jesus only was a created being. He was not God incarnate. And because of that, those people of Hispania, which had been won by some missionaries earlier, and they were pretty much Orthodox, they hated the Visigoth rulers. In 589, King Ricard, who was the Visigoth ruler, renounced Arianism. He had been in all kinds of battles and so forth. He finally adopted the Nicene Creed, became an Orthodox official leader of that country. Pretty bold move on his part to do that. And because of that, because of moving to the Orthodox faith in 589, this is before the Muslim invasion, Spain became a place of great learning and great center of knowledge. It established great universities and so forth, but all that was cut short in just a few years, from 589 till about 70? Yeah, some of those years, 670. When the Muslims invaded, it all went away. And by the way, all through North Africa there was won by the Muslims, as you look across there. All the influence of Christianity in Carthage and Alexandria, and all the Greek learning and wisdom was all just wiped away in a matter of decades as the Muslims moved through. They destroyed. You see the folks over in those countries now tearing down churches, destroying crosses, tearing down and destroying, blowing up ancient artifacts. You see that in the news? It's exactly what these folks did, because to them that was worshiping gods they didn't believe in, and had no significance to them. So again, that's sort of typical of that group. Okay, 709, Caliph al-Walid gave permission. Tariq was the governor of Tangier, which is just south of the Gibraltar mountain there, Strait of Gibraltar. He was the governor of Tangier. His desire was to just sort of test out Hispania, Spain, across the way. Just a few miles across this small, narrow waterway. And Caliph, who was over in Damascus, gave permission to Tariq to invade or to give a trial. They would always do a trial run, see how things work. Tariq had just seen some of the battles going on in Spain, or heard of them, because there were battles between the Visigoths and the Orthodox groups that were fighting each other over in Spain. He saw Christians fighting Christians. He thought to himself, well, that's interesting. Maybe we should get in on the fight. We'll see what we can do. Of course, because of the weakness of their fighting, they also ended up getting beaten back. Let me just read you a couple of things here. Let me see if I can find a page here. The weakness of the 7th century Spain, it was not in their religious intolerance, because they were rough on the Jews. Those leaders hated the Jews and persecuted them terribly. But it was the monarchical system. The Visigoth system was any suitable member of the ruling family, not just the oldest son, could become king, could succeed to the throne. Well, you know what that would end up being. It encouraged assassination. And out of the some, I don't know how many, 33 kings who were in line, all but 3 were deposed by assassination and so forth. And so there was a lot of political going on. Spain was weak because of that. So when Tariq is asked to give a trial and enter in there and see what's going to go on, he had it great because they were weak politically, militarily, because they'd been beating up on each other. Took an army in 711, crossed the little channel there, and crossed at a place called Jabal Tariq. That means Tariq's mountain. And that's where we get the name Gibraltar, by the way. Jabal Tar, Gibraltar, comes from those 2 words, the Mount of Tariq. He was aided by 5,000 Berbers. Remember those Berbers across the northern African area? These folks are still there today. Their culture is still around. They're still a very unique group of people. And they overcame, down the south of Spain there, Roderick, who was at that time the Visigoth ruler. And the army that he had was blown away because of the disunity. He had a Visigoth, and Visigoths were also very tribal, and because when he attacked them, many of those folks would rather deal rather than fight. And they said, let's just go home. And his armies were all wiped away. And these Muslim invaders crossing over into Spain, that very small area of Spain down there, all of a sudden thought, aha, Allah must be with us again. We're winning, God must be behind us. And with a small army, they could have such great success. That was the winning strategy of this Muslim empire over these centuries, over these years. It was to go in, try it out, win the battle, and say, oh, God's with us, let's keep going. And so Tariq kept continuing his conquest, town after town. Again, the local people in Spain, because they were fed up with the Visigoth control, the local people welcomed these Muslim invaders. They're like, come on in, we didn't care for those Visigoth overlords anyway. And the Jews, especially because of the persecution, they especially welcomed these folks in. They've been mistreated and persecuted for decades. And so what Tariq's strategy was, very simple strategy, he would come in with his troops, conquer a town, leave a Jewish leader, one of the members of the community, in charge as a governor or mayor or whatever in charge of that town, and a few troops of his to kind of keep the control of the city, and then move on to the next town. And so those local people were more or less helping out the Muslims as they moved forward. By the end of 711, the last of that year, the Muslim people owned half of the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain there, that whole area there. They owned at least half of this region here in 1 year. I mean, that's how fast they moved. The Caliph was way over in Damascus, who wasn't too happy about it because he felt like, oh, you can go in for a trial, but don't just keep going. He came and gave Tariq a rough time, and consequently back and forth. It was an odd situation. But when they moved further north, to the very top of the country of Spain here, right around this red area, actually it's a long strip along there, they ran into some resistance. Actually, the Muslims had to quit there because it was called Covadonga, and it was a Visigoth stronghold, but the troops, 25,000 Muslim troops, attacked there. And they were beaten back by Pelayo, this is Roderick's cousin, and because it was a mountainous region, they were drawn into a ravine, and from that ravine they dropped boldly down upon this invading army. Crushed many of them. And then there was this river, Diva River, running through there, and because of a storm, it had flooded, many of them because of the flood drowned. So it was almost like God saying, don't you come in here, this isn't worth it. In fact, they said that. It's not worth the fight. Let's just leave them alone. That northern Spain area, we'll leave them be, and we'll go to the northeast. We'll leave them to the northwest alone. So that was good for Spain, I guess, for that time. But as a result of that, Pelayo's son, was it a son? Yeah, his son Alfonso, who would come from this region, would relaunch a conquest of Spain. In other words, heading south. And over a 700-year period, of course, he didn't do it all, but he started this reconquest of Spain, beginning right there at the Battle of Covadonga, moving south. They began to retake Spain. Took 700 years to do it, but they did retake most of Spain, even though the Muslim influence is still there today. By 725, they were moved into the northeast region here. You can't really tell there, but you can see the brown outline of the areas they had moved into what Burgundy, which we call France today, and parts of the Franks. Franks was what we call French-German people who lived there at that time. Now, what the Muslims really wanted by doing this, at least what we read from history, they wanted a northern route all the way back over to Damascus. They wanted a route here they could take people all around. In other words, they wanted the whole Mediterranean region around the Mediterranean Sea. They wanted all of Europe. That was their intention of where they were heading to. Now, when it came to the Franks, these people were known for something, several things they were known for. I think I wrote down on your page there, were known for many things, their fervent fidelity to Christian orthodoxy. In other words, what we believe, the Nicene Creed, who Jesus is. They were solid in their belief. They were not Visigoths. They were Orthodox believers. They had saintly monks and nuns amongst them in their communes. They had a fearless ferocity in war. They had a determination. When they wanted to do something, they went for it. And infrequently, not infrequently, there were extreme cruelty in the way in which they treated people. Now what they didn't have the long sabers and spears like the Muslims did. They had battle axes. They had these axes and double-edged bladed axes and swords and so forth. They didn't have all the equipment. They had leather garments and they rode on horses as well, but they didn't have all that the Muslims had, but they were fierce fighters. And at the Battle of Tours in 732, they stopped this Muslim onslaught. As Muslims intended to keep on going all the way across Europe, Charles Martel, the leader, who was at that time bringing all of the Franks together, he brought some other countries' troops in as well, and they fought a battle there at Tours. And let me read the account, if I have it here somewhere. Here it is. The Battle of Tours, Pope Gregory III, he's not the one we talked about earlier, but he's a different pope, called all the soldiers of Europe to join the Frankish King Charles Martel. Who drove the Syrians, anyway. Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne, who actually united all of this region several years later. But anyway, he assembled 30,000 troops, and never had there been such a large army in Europe up to that time. Not only to stop this invasion, but because of him, Europe would not at that time become Muslim. Without armor or horses, just spears, swords, and axes, Martel's fur-clad men, they had leather on, that's all they had. They secretly marched in back trails to a wooded hill up from the Muslim camp. The next day, the surprised Muslim commander, his name was Abdul Rahman, ordered an attack. His heavy cavalry, covered in chainmail armor, they were ready, they are all set here. 20-foot-long lances, cavalry wielding bows and scimitar swords. But he found it difficult charging up this tree-covered hill. You see, the strategy of the Islamic people was one. The Moors, the Berbers, their whole philosophy was just straight frontal attack, which meant constant killing of people. And in fact, it was just a sea of dead bodies in front of them in this attack as they tried to mount this hill. It says the men of the north, the Franks, seemed like a sea that cannot be moved. With their swords, they hewed down the arrows. These folks carried all before them. Their tireless hands drove their swords down the breast of their foes. All this description of this tremendous battle. And at the height of the battle, these folks from the Muslim world pulled back. These Berbers and who did I say the leader was? Lost his name. Anyway, Tariq. Actually, he was defeated in battle. Abdul Rahman was the man. And his people knew he was dead, but the Franks didn't know it. And here they were at the top of this hill, waiting the next day for another attack, the frontal attack. That's all they could do. They didn't do any side attacks. It was always frontal. And they were sitting there waiting that morning. It didn't come. A little bit longer, it didn't come. They thought, we should go down there, but they thought, it's a trick. They're trying to get us to come down there, and then they're going to attack us. So they sent a few scouts down, checked it out, realized the enemy just disappeared. Their king, their leader had been killed, and they didn't even know it. It's all the spoil, the wealth that they had taken in their previous battles was there. They had all that back, but they had won the battle. Didn't even realize it. And Charles Martel became a hero, and in fact, he became known as Charles the Hammer. That name, really goes through all of history. People remember that is the one person who led a charge to stop this movement of the Muslim world to take over the entire continent of Europe. And it was a powerful battle. Let me see if I've got one more thing I can share with you. Oh, Gibbon, who wrote the history of the Western Empire, spoke of that as a decisive battle for the future of Europe. But all of Europe, basically, because of his this Frank, this Charles the Hammer, stopping that. It affected the entire history of Europe as we know it. And of course it affects us because our ancestors came from this place. Now Muslims, in their history, they would say, oh no, that's not the case. He was just doing exploratory battle like they always did, exploratory raid, and he didn't, but that was the pattern of the Muslims all the time. They always did that. They always attacked first, and then they found out they could win, they keep going. So it was the pattern that was conclusively smashed at that point, and it stopped the Muslim attack, at least on that end of Europe, the western end of Europe. Now, coming back a few years before this, we come to the Battle of Constantinople. Of course, Constantinople is located here, right at that straight there, Bosphorus. Let me see if I can move that on. I didn't realize I had this, and this is Battle of Tours, and where they were located. Whoops. Tours is right here. Charles brought all his troops down here, stopped them right here by that river, and sent them back. In fact, they pulled back into Spain as a result of that. Now, coming to Constantinople, this is actually a few years beforehand, but just to keep in mind, the eastern side of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine area, this battle for Constantinople also had a very great historical significance because it kept Europe from being invaded from both sides. Constantinople, that little dot right there. The Navy, the Islamic Navy, the ships came in here to the Hellespont, which is about a 90-mile channel right through here. They all came through here. They settled up here and were waiting to attack Constantinople right there. They had troops on this side, everywhere, all ready to invade. They had an outstanding navy. They were going to wipe out this city. Let me see if I can show you. This is what Constantinople looked like. Over the centuries, even to today, it was protected on three sides by water. Water kept them safe all around this whole area here. So basically, they were protected. Of course, they had a wall here on this side to protect them from a land invasion. But all those ships that came, they weren't protected anymore. But there was something that was a unique thing. They had a technological device. And they had discovered this, and they kept it secret, which is one of the greatest secrets of history, of Christian history, and that was called Greek fire. It was some kind of a combination of propellant or explosive or like gasoline, naphthalene, I'm not sure what it was, because nobody even knows today what it was. But they would put this stuff in their ships, and they had a brass tube at the end of their ships, and they would shoot it out to the other ships. They were small little boats. They weren't huge vessels like the Muslims had. They were just small ships. But they had this stuff called Greek fire, and they would spray it out, and that's an image of it, on the neighboring ship, and it would burn the ship, it would burn everything. If it got on your skin, it would not stop. If you put your skin underwater, it would still continue to burn. So these people on the ship, it was terrifying to them. They could jump off the ship into the water, and they still burn. They come to the surface, it still continued to burn. It burned the ships down. It had them flee in fear. And basically, they not only used it in the ships, but then they put it up on the walls of their protective areas and threw it down upon the invading troops. I mean, it was terrorizing folks. And all these Muslim people, by 718, Umar, the leader of the Muslims, who brought all this into being, had his troops to retreat and said, we can't do it. We can't win this battle. And they left. Now, 700 years later, they did come back and win Constantinople, but at least at this time, from the west to the east, the Roman Empire, at least what was left of it, was protected. All of Europe was protected, which says a lot for us. It shows us that our ancestors, because of their faithfulness and standing up to this, it kept us from being overtaken and being living now today, studying the Quran instead of studying the Bible. Anyway, they lost all serious interest in the land of the Franks, all serious interest for centuries in Constantinople to the east. They wanted to stay away. They didn't know about this Greek fire and how it worked, but they were afraid of it, and they stayed away. So it's amazing how technology in those days brought safety for you might say, our ancestors, at least our spiritual ancestors. That's all we have. Do you have any questions on Thank you for your
Where
question.
are all these crucifixions of Muslims that Mama talked about? Where did that come in?
It's going on today, maybe?
No, I'm talking about back there, span of time.
That's the orthodoxy revisionist history of anti-Christian.
Okay. Now,
And what he's asking.
yeah, I'm not familiar with talking about
It
it.
never occurred.
Yeah, never occurred.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the things that have been said about how, and the Crusades were much later than this, but basically the Crusades were going back and taking Jerusalem and Palestine back because they felt that was the land of Jesus, that was the Holy Land of the Leader. For doing that, it was not, we were not invading at least not we, the Christian element of Europe was not doing it to inflict harm as much as taking back, although there was a lot of things that were wrong about it, but they were taking back what had been taken. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyway, what you see today, you see a lot of things. Now we're going to jump from here. This is what is this, the 7th century, 8th century. We're going to jump all the way up to almost the present day, the last few hundred years. Because really there's been no different change in the 1,400 years since then. Because they were, all through the years, they were fighting back and forth, conquering city, taking people into slavery. The same things that happened here for the next 1,000 or so years. The same thing. The Muslims do their stealing of slaves and conquering of places and conquering, reconquering, back and forth all through these years. So we could cover all that, but it wouldn't do any good because it's basically what they did then. It's still continuing all through the next several hundred years. But we'll meet again in a couple of weeks for that.